May 14th, 1945. 500 feet above the Pacific, southeast of Kyushu. A dense marine layer blankets the sea, softening the horizon into a ghost-gray blur. The sun's first rays pierce through in shafts of gold, flickering off the wavetops like glass shrapnel. Below, 70 miles off the southern coast of Japan, the USS Enterprise carves a steady wake through the morning swells. Her island bristling with antennae, her decks alive with motion. From the pilot's seat of a Mitsubishi A6M50, Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu grips the stick with pale knuckles. Sweat trickles beneath his flight goggles. He's been flying for 90 minutes, nap of the earth, using every scrap of mist and ocean chop to remain unseen. His target looms ahead. The Enterprise, the Big E, the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy. Her decks are loaded with fighters and bombers of Air Group 90, readying for another strike over Kyushu. From this height, the carrier looks oddly vulnerable. Just another slab of steel in a restless sea. But Tomiyasu knows better. He's watched her aircraft rip through formations like a scythe. His own squadron is gone. Now it's only him. And the 550-pound bomb bolted under his Zero's belly. Below, on the Enterprise's flight deck, Airman Second Class Charlie McPherson finishes securing the catapult hooks on an F-6F Hellcat when the call crackles over the 1MC. General Quarters, bogey inbound. Low altitude. Vector 217, range 7 miles and closing. Sirens wail. The deck crew scatters into pre-assigned positions like clockwork cogs. Officers bark commands. Below decks, 5-inch gun crews scramble to magazines. Ammunition hoists rattle to life. The carrier begins a sharp turn to port, not to flee, but to bring her full array of anti-aircraft guns to bear. Above them, Tomiyasu breaches a final wall of mist and emerges into clear light and into the teeth of steel. The Enterprise's combat air patrol is minutes away, chasing shadows on a false bearing. The sky around the carrier lights up with the chatter of 40mm Bofors. Bright, angry tracers arc through the air, stitching wild lines through the sky. The 5-inchers belch flame and smoke from their barrels. The ship rocks from its own fury. And through this chaos, a realization begins to dawn. The very design of the Enterprise's flight deck may save it. As Tomiyasu dives, a pair of SBD Dauntlesses are already being moved into launch position. Not from the crowded mid-deck elevator, but from a sleek, new innovation. The Deck Edge elevator. Swinging up from the starboard side, it places aircraft directly onto the launch path, bypassing the bottleneck of earlier designs. The innovation isn't just mechanical, it's tactical. Time matters. Seconds matter. And while Tomiyasu streaks toward the ship, those extra seconds are the difference between chaos and readiness. It wasn't always like this. Once, moving aircraft to the flight deck meant rearranging an entire lineup of planes, elevators groaning with each haul. But now, with deck edge elevators, the U.S. Navy could cycle fighters with breathtaking speed. And today, speed is everything. Tomiyasu's Zero screams in low. Bofors rounds pepper the air. A near miss rocks his wings. He tightens his grip. His eyes lock on the flight deck, now filling his windscreen. He sees the faces of the men, the flash of helmets, the figures waving him off or firing up at him. His jaw clenches. The deck races toward him. Then, impact. A column of smoke and flame bursts from the aft quarter. The bomb strikes just off the flight deck's port side. Damage, but not destruction. Below, chaos, but not collapse. And within minutes, even before the smoke clears, the deck edge elevator lowers again. Another Hellcat is rising, engines screaming, ready to launch. The men on deck barely look up. They've seen this before. They've trained for it. Because speed is life, and readiness is survival. And it was this mechanical miracle on the edge of the flight deck, that changed carrier warfare forever. Long before deck-edge elevators became standard, American flat-tops struggled with a flaw no one wanted to admit: their own efficiency. In the early years of the Pacific War, the flight decks of carriers like Yorktown, Hornet, and even the original Lexington were marvels of steel and timing. Planes launched in waves, retrieved in squadrons, and were sent below decks to rearm and refuel. But the real bottleneck wasn't in the skies. It was in the hangar elevators. The centerline elevator, a square platform sunken flush with the middle of the flight deck, was the heart of carrier operations. It lifted dive bombers and fighters from the dark, greasy hangar deck up into the sunlight, where flight crews scrambled to hook them into catapults. But there was a cost. To use the elevator, aircraft had to wait in line. Deck crews had to move planes aside. The process took precious minutes, and in battle, minutes killed. Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman once remarked that trying to launch planes from a full deck felt like playing chess on a moving table during a storm with your pieces on fire. On May 8, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, this flaw was exposed. Aboard the Lexington, a team of F-4F Wildcats sat idling, waiting for lift. By the time the center elevator had finished its cycle, a Japanese bomb tore through the forward section of the ship. Those fighters never launched, and though the Lexington's damage was catastrophic for other reasons, officers took notice. Their own system slowed them down. Victory would come to those who could launch faster, recover quicker, and adapt under fire. By 1943, design innovations had begun trickling into the blueprints of the new Essex-class carriers. The USS Intrepid, Franklin, Ticonderoga. They all featured a radical addition: a deck-edge elevator. It was simple in concept, yet revolutionary in practice. Mounted on the starboard side of the ship, the elevator could carry aircraft from the hangar deck and bring them topside without disturbing operations on the main flight deck. There was no need to shuffle aircraft out of the way. No more awkward repositioning. A plane could rise from the belly of the ship and in moments be locked into a catapult and hurled skyward, even as others landed on the stern. On paper, it saved 30 seconds per launch. In combat, it meant the difference between intercepting a kamikaze and writing letters to families. Back aboard the Enterprise on that fateful morning in May 45, the lesson paid off. Smoke still hung in the air. Fragments of the kamikaze's Zero had scorched the deck edge. A hose team sprinted to contain fires licking along the port catwalk. But operations never halted. Below deck, a team of ordnance men rolled out another F-6F. Its wings were folded, its guns clean. The pilot, Lieutenant James "Tex" Brannan, slid into the seat, one boot still halfway laced. The deck-edge elevator groaned to life. It rose from the lower bay like a piston from a battleship's gun. Steel on steel shrieked. The plane lifted through smoke and sunlight, emerging beside the flight deck instead of on top of it. Tex saw the sea to his right, the chaos ahead, and the flight officer waving him forward. "You're up! Go!" There was no time to think, only to act. Tex throttled forward. The plane jolted, roared, and screamed down the deck. As he lifted off, he banked hard left, scanning for the next threat. The sky was empty, for now. But below, more planes were rising. The elevator sank again. Another Wildcat, another Avenger, another set of wings ready to fight. Without this system, the Enterprise may have suffered worse. Without it, many ships in earlier battles had. But now, on the edge of Japan's home islands, innovation gave America speed, and speed saved lives. Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Virginia, January 1941. The Atlantic wind blew cold through the dry dock alleys as designers from the Bureau of Ships huddled in oil-stained overcoats, sketching diagrams in the margins of blueprints. A new generation of fleet carriers was on the drawing board. Ships that would fight not theoretical battles, but real ones, now inevitable after Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Donald Engen, a young but sharp aviation officer, stood beside a scale model of the proposed Essex-class carrier. He traced a pencil across the flight deck outline, stopping at the small square representing the hangar elevator. "We need to think sideways," he said. The men around him raised eyebrows. Engen clarified, "Move the elevator off the center line. Mount it on the edge of the deck. Free the main path for takeoffs and landings." Some scoffed, others whispered. It sounded reckless. The flight deck was sacred and balanced. Any weight shift could throw off operations, endanger launches, even stress the hull. But Engen pushed harder. "You can launch fighters while the next wave rises into place. You don't wait. You fight faster." It took time. Test models were built. Elevator platforms bolted to mock hulls. They failed. They creaked. They tilted unevenly. But eventually, after months of iteration and arguments with traditionalists, the concept passed muster. By late 1942, the final plans for the Essex class included the first starboard side deck edge elevator. And when the USS Essex launched in July 1942, she carried not only a bigger air group and tougher armor, she carried an experiment bolted to her skin. At sea, it proved priceless. In the South Pacific 1943, Essex was blooded in battle. Raids on Marcus Island and Wake revealed the elevator's utility under fire. As dauntless dive bombers lumbered off the deck in waves, new planes rose from the side lift, like reinforcements arriving on cue. Launch tempo improved by nearly 40%. By the time the U.S. invaded Tarawa and the Marshalls, the Navy had found its rhythm. Hellcats, Avengers, Corsairs all cycled through the carrier's veins with lethal precision. Damage control teams praised the innovation. Unlike centerline elevators, which risked jamming if the deck was cratered by bombs, the edge-mounted platforms could be bypassed or used independently. There was another, less talked-about advantage: survivability. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, what history now calls the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, waves of Japanese aircraft tried to overwhelm Task Force 58 on carriers like Enterprise, Lexington, and Hornet. The deck-edge elevators moved aircraft up, even as others came back damaged. The ability to rotate air groups without interrupting landing operations was no longer theoretical. It was saving lives in real time. Back on the Enterprise in May 1945, Lieutenant Tex Brannan circled above the fleet after his launch. His Hellcats radio buzzed with calls from destroyer pickets reporting more incoming raids. The Japanese weren't done yet. Kamikazes were probing for any hole in the screen. From his altitude, Tex could see the Enterprise below. Smoke trailing from her aft guns, deck crew sprinting to launch the next group. The elevator platform groaned once more, this time lifting an SB-2C Helldiver to the surface. Its wings snapped into place like the click of a chambered round. It was mechanical choreography, part ballet, part battlefield. Below the deck, in the hangar bay, Lieutenant Commander William Styx Randall wiped engine grease from his face and yelled over the roar of maintenance crews. "Next one up. Let's move like we mean it." They always did, because every second mattered. The Japanese pilots diving toward them didn't care about elegant design or engineering diagrams. They cared only about fire and death. And if an elevator system bought the Enterprise another 10 seconds, that might be all the ship needed to live. May 14th, 1945, 07 to 15 hours. The flight deck of USS Enterprise rattled beneath the boots of Air Group 90 as more aircraft moved into launch position. The fires aft had been contained. The Japanese Zero that struck minutes ago left scars in the paint, scorch marks on the railings, and a tear in the catwalk. But the ship wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was picking up speed. From the bridge, Admiral Mark Mitcher watched calmly. He said nothing as a second kamikaze report crackled in over TBS radio. 2 bogies, low and fast, bearing 205, possibly Kai 43s. The old aviator didn't flinch. He simply turned to his flag lieutenant and muttered, "Launch the rest. Keep the deck clear." Then he turned back toward the sea, chewing slowly on his pipe stem. Below, on the hangar deck, crewmen in oil-streaked dungarees worked with machine-like intensity. Every movement was part of a larger dance. Ordnance men loaded belts of .50 caliber rounds into gun bays. Armorers tightened wing bolts. Radio men did last-minute checks on SCR 522 sets. The roar of Pratt & Whitney radial engines was constant, a low, living thunder. And there, bolted to the starboard edge of the hull, the elevator platform rose again. Another helldiver emerged into the morning sun like an armored phoenix. Lieutenant Ernest Rusty Walters, a former crop duster from Kansas who had joined up in 42, wiped condensation from his canopy and looked down at the deck crew signaling him forward. He was about to take off for a strike on a radar station outside Miyazaki, a mission planned just 20 minutes earlier. His aircraft had gone from hangar to launch in 6 minutes flat. The deck edge elevator made it possible. In another carrier, earlier in the war, the delay would have been triple that. The enemy didn't wait, and neither could they. By now, most fleet carriers had adopted some variation of the deck edge system. It became the unspoken hero of modern naval aviation. Quiet, unnoticed by most history books, but always in motion. When planes caught fire, the elevator whisked fresh birds topside. When the deck was cluttered with damaged aircraft, the platform brought up replacements from below, keeping the fight alive. It changed how flight crews thought. It changed how commanders planned. Strike packages could now be reconfigured in real time. Launches were no longer done in huge blocks, but in rolling cycles, small waves, custom fit to the threat at hand. It gave American carriers rhythm, a pulse of steel and gasoline that could keep time with the fastest-moving battlefield in the world. And yet, it wasn't just about speed. It was about resilience. At Okinawa, USS Bunker Hill took 2 kamikaze hits in 60 seconds. Fires raged for hours. But even there, even as men were blown into the sea and black smoke rose 500 feet into the air, one of the deck edge elevators was still functional. It helped lift survivors to safety. It brought up hoses. It carried stretchers. It became a lifeline. Steel designed to launch warplanes became steel that saved lives. Back aboard the Enterprise, Tex Brannan's Hellcat circled again. He saw the second wave of enemy aircraft coming in. Tight formation, sun behind them. Fighters were being launched now 2 at a time. The deck edge elevator was working non-stop. The catapult crews barely had time to reset. Tex keyed his radio. "Control, this is Banshee 3. I've got 6 bogies inbound, low. Recommend scramble now. You've got maybe 1 minute." "Roger, Banshee 3. We're on it." And they were. The deck edge elevator groaned again. Another Hellcat rose. Another engine roared to life. Another chance to survive. May 14th, 1945, 07:20 hours. 50 feet above the Pacific, silver shadows skimmed the waves. 6 Japanese Nakajima Ki 43, Oscar fighters flying just high enough to stay off radar, just low enough to make the shot count. Strapped beneath two of them, 250-kilogram bombs, crude but lethal when slammed into a steel hull at 300 knots. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakano, gripped the stick with gloved hands. His vision blurred slightly from engine fumes and salt spray. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours in days. But that didn't matter now. Ahead, like a dark island in the ocean, the American carrier loomed. He'd seen its silhouette in training manuals. Tall island tower, wide deck. This was the Enterprise. Killing her would mean everything. If only he could break through the steel ring around her. On the American side, no one was standing still. The Combat Information Center aboard Enterprise had already relayed the incoming direction. The flight deck was a fury of motion. Launch crews sprinted across non-skid steel. Whistles blew. A Hellcat was hooked to Catapult 2. Lieutenant Rusty Walters, ready to fly his second sortie of the day, pushed his throttle forward as the deck officer gave the go. A blast of steam. The carrier shuddered. The Hellcat shot forward and vanished into the morning sky. Behind him, the deck edge elevator lowered again, ready to bring up the next aircraft. It never paused. It couldn't afford to. 20 miles out, the picket destroyer USS Hadley opened fire. 5-inch guns booming into the haze. One Oscar spiraled away, trailing smoke, then plunged into the water. But 4 more kept coming, drawing a line straight toward the task force's heart. Tex Brannon, still circling in his Hellcat, spotted them. He keyed his transmitter with urgency. CIC, I've got eyes on bandits. 4 confirmed, 1 trailing smoke. They're hugging the wavetops. Fast. You've got less than 90 seconds. Below him, the deck edge elevator lifted again. A TBM Avenger, bomb bay loaded, rumbled forward. Its wings locked open with a thunk as the deck officer signaled a hard left. This wasn't just launching planes anymore. This was a race against death. It was the kind of moment that exposed everything. Without the deck edge elevator, those Avengers and Hellcats would have been stuck in the hangar bay, waiting for the centerline elevator to clear, for planes to shuffle, for time to pass. But now, planes moved in a rhythm like a piston engine. Up, forward, gone. It was simple, brutal, effective. By 07:23 hours, 4 more aircraft had launched. Tex dove. His 650 cals opened up, sending glowing tracers into the low-flying formation. 1 Oscar disintegrated. Smoke and debris streaking the sky. Another tried to climb, too late. A second Hellcat, just launched from Enterprise, came in from above, cutting across its path. More fire, another kill. But one slipped through. Nakano. He hugged the sea so close his prop wash left rooster tails. The Enterprise's gunners tracked him. 40mm Bofors clattered, 5-inchers roared. He rose slightly, just enough to strike. But in those final seconds, a miracle happened. An Avenger, lifted seconds earlier by the deck edge elevator, taxied forward, fast. It blocked the bomb's ideal impact point on the deck's center. Nakano hesitated, a blink, then yanked the stick. Too late. The Zero clipped the catwalk, rolled sideways, and exploded in a bloom of fire against the flight deck's edge. The bomb detonated mid-roll, sending a shockwave down the starboard side. Men were thrown. A railing ripped loose. Smoke poured into the sky. But the ship lived. The forward catapult survived. The elevator platform, blackened but intact, was already retracting to bring up the next bird. Because the fight wasn't over. Because the system worked. May 14th, 1945, 7:30 hours. The Enterprise limped through a haze of smoke and salt, her flight deck scorched, her crew bruised and bloodied, but still moving. From a distance, the Big E looked wounded, but only just. No fireball had silenced her guns. No explosion had stilled her elevators. She had taken yet another blow and answered the only way she knew how, with more airplanes in the sky. Below decks, the repair parties were already cutting twisted railing away with acetylene torches. Men shouted orders over the roar of machinery and the thud of moving parts. Bulkheads had been blackened. One fire door jammed shut under the shock wave. Still, in the hangar bay, engine crews worked on the next group of fighters. Some stripped for parts, others prepped to fly again. And through the smoke, still moving, still lifting, the deck-edge elevator. Boatswain's mate first class. Henry Fulton, who'd manned the elevator platform since sunrise, wiped his face with an oily rag and looked at the steel under his boots. The edge had taken shrapnel. One corner was bent, but it moved. The platform didn't stick, it didn't crack, it held. He banged twice on the railing and signaled to the next team. "Bring up the Wildcat." They did, and the steel kept rising. Above, the sky was no longer clean. More smoke columns twisted into the blue as other ships in Task Force 58 opened fire on late stragglers. One kamikaze was shot down just feet from the bunker hill. Another clipped the destroyer Evans, sending a dozen sailors into the sea. Yet for all the chaos, the carriers held. And they held because they could launch, and launch fast. That fact wasn't lost on the pilots. Tex Brannan rejoined the formation, 3 Hellcats strong. Their mission wasn't to patrol now. It was to intercept the next inbound flight. He spotted 2 Oscars far to the west, climbing toward the sun. A chase. No time for planning. Just throttle, angle, and instinct. He flipped his radio to open comms. "Banshee flight, let's take the edge. Don't let 'em circle back." The edge. That word meant more than just the perimeter. It was a mindset, born from a ship that had been operating on the very edge of possibility all morning. Carrier design was never static. Every wartime lesson was paid for in blood, fire, and steel. In early designs, carriers had prioritized armor or speed. But in the Pacific, the real test became tempo. Could a flat-decked ship keep up with a 1,000-mile air war? Could it recover wounded birds, launch counterstrikes, and still absorb punishment? The answer came not just from the men, but from the machinery they trusted. And few pieces of gear earned more trust than the deck-edge elevator. It was never flashy, never mentioned in press releases. But to the men who depended on it, it was everything. On the Enterprise, it kept the war moving forward, 1 aircraft at a time. At 0750 hours, 30 minutes after the last Zero hit the water, Admiral Mitcher stood silently on the flag bridge, watching the deck below as another aircraft launched. His pipe had gone out. He didn't relight it. He turned to his air officer and said simply, "Count how many we've put up today." The officer scribbled in a worn notebook. 26 since 0630, 15 launched using the deck edge lift. And sir, only 1 stuck. Mitcher nodded. Then keep launching, because even when damaged, even when scarred and shaking, Enterprise could still fight. Because that elevator still moved, and that meant Japan would hear from them again by noon. May 14th, 1945, or wait 10 hours. The sun now hung higher over the Pacific, its light no longer soft but glaring, bouncing off the ocean's surface like polished glass. Sweat poured beneath the helmets. Deck crews on the Enterprise worked with shirts soaked, their faces smeared with soot and salt. Yet the rhythm never slowed. Aircraft launched, others landed, and the deck edge elevator kept rising and falling, like a heartbeat made of iron. Below deck, in the hangar bay, the air was dense with fumes, exhaust, oil, the metallic sting of scorched paint. Chief Petty Officer Lou Harmon barked orders over the whine of power tools. "Get that Dauntless fueled and check her port flap. I want her on the next cycle." He didn't need to explain why. Everyone on board understood. When the Japanese came, you didn't meet them with words. You met them with wings, and wings required steel to move them. The elevator platform, bolted to the Enterprise's starboard edge, was no longer just a device. It had become a symbol, a bridge between the chaos below and the firepower above. Each time it rose from the hangar deck, it didn't just carry aircraft. It carried America's answer to every incoming threat. Elsewhere in the task force, other ships had begun adopting the same rhythm. On USS Hancock, a newer Essex-class carrier just miles away, her deck-edge elevator lifted a fully armed Corsair to the flight deck. 2 minutes later, it was airborne, streaking toward the western horizon. And on USS Bunker Hill, still smoldering from the kamikaze hit that morning, the damage control crews worked to clear debris from her elevator housing. They knew it had to be operational by the next wave, or they'd fall behind. Carrier warfare wasn't just about size anymore. It was about flow. You had to launch, recover, reload, and relaunch, not in hours, but in minutes. The sky didn't wait, and neither did the enemy. Back on Enterprise, Tex Brannan's flight had intercepted the last of the morning raiders. One Oscar tried to bank away, heading back toward Kyushu, but Tex caught him over open water. A short burst from his wing guns, and the plane disintegrated, trailing smoke into the sea. "Splash one," he muttered, almost mechanically. He banked right, saw the fleet below, rows of ships, wakes like ribbons stretching across the ocean, and at the center, the blackened but defiant deck of Enterprise. He clicked his mic. "CIC, this is Banshee 3. Sky's clear for now. Returning for fuel." On the carrier, the deck-edge elevator was already lifting another Avenger into position. The crew didn't look up. They didn't need to. Their eyes were on the next bird, the next launch, the next 5 seconds. Because that was the war now. 5 seconds at a time. It wasn't always like this. Early in the war, American carriers had struggled with launch cycles. Planes sat idle on the hangar deck as flight crews fought to reposition aircraft, clear paths, and avoid deadly logjams. At Coral Sea, at Midway, even in victory, time was the enemy. If a pilot had to wait 20 minutes for his turn on the elevator, that might mean missing the intercept, or worse, being caught on deck during an enemy strike. But now, in the final months of the war, that had changed. The deck-edge elevator was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine. It allowed aircraft to be loaded, fueled, and brought topside in parallel to ongoing operations. No more waiting. No more halting takeoffs to shift planes around. The rhythm had become fluid, almost organic. And aboard Enterprise, a ship built before the idea ever existed, that rhythm had been adapted, tested, and perfected, because this ship refused to become obsolete. She evolved. She had become faster, meaner, and she'd be ready when the next siren howled. May 14th, 1945, 0900 hours. The Pacific heat had begun to settle like a heavy quilt over the fleet. Sweat rolled down necks. Oil sizzled on bare metal. Still, no one paused. Not the deck crew on the Enterprise, not the air crews below, not the sailors in fire-retardant gear, patching steel with their bare hands. The enemy might not be in the sky right now, but everyone knew better. He'd be back. On the starboard edge of the carrier, the elevator let out a mechanical groan and began to rise again. A Wildcat, rearmed and refueled, emerged from the darkness of the hangar bay, its nose blackened from an earlier sortie. The plane's fuselage bore scorch marks, one flap slightly dented, but she was flyable, and that was enough. "Send it," the launch officer called. The Wildcat roared forward, took the catapult's full thrust, and was airborne within seconds. A sailor nearby muttered, "That elevator's doing more lifting today than half the fleet." What the Enterprise had that morning, what set her apart, wasn't luck. It was legacy. This was a ship that had survived everything. Santa Cruz, the Solomons, torpedo hits, bomb strikes, even being declared sunk more than once by Tokyo Rose. Her bones had been shaken and scorched across every ocean in the Pacific. And yet, here she was, fighting. And a large part of that resilience was mechanical, welded into her hull, bolted into her guts. Systems like the deck edge elevator weren't afterthoughts anymore. They were lifelines. Each cycle of that platform meant fewer delays, fewer sitting ducks on deck, more fighters in the sky, more pilots coming home. Down in the hangar bay, Chief Harmon leaned over an Avenger with two crewmen, both covered in soot and grime. "We've got 40 minutes before next launch block. I want the turrets swapped, the bomb rack cleaned, and that engine breathing." The younger mechanic, barely 19, looked up. She took a shell fragment in the cowling. Harmon didn't blink. "Then patch her with coffee cans if you have to. We're flying her." And they did. The Wildcat wasn't the only thing rising. A Helldiver followed next, its wings folded tight as it rode the platform up like a warrior climbing back into the ring. Men saluted it from the hangar deck below, not out of ceremony, but out of habit. This elevator, this simple lift of steel, had become a kind of altar. It sent their brothers back into the sky. Some came back, some didn't. But all of them went with honor. Back on the bridge, Admiral Mitcher surveyed the deck. It was scarred, pitted from fragments, blackened in sections. But it was clean, ordered, alive. He saw the next launch cycle forming already. "She's moving like a fresh build," he muttered. Captain Groves, standing nearby, cracked a rare grin. "You'd think she was 20 years younger." Mitcher tapped the binoculars against his leg. "She fights younger than any ship I've ever sailed." In the ready room, Lieutenant Tex Brannan checked his flight board. Another strike planned. This time, deeper into Kyushu. Enemy supply lines, rail yards, one of the last arteries feeding the island's war machine. He stood and pulled on his harness. As he stepped onto the catwalk, he passed the deck edge elevator rising again. Another bird ready, another chance to strike. He paused for a second, looked down at the mechanism. Still steaming, still shaking slightly from its own strain, but steady. He reached out and tapped the guardrail with his glove. "Keep lifting," he whispered. Then he stepped out into the sun, into the roar of the deck, and into war once more. May 14th, 1945, 0940 hours. The deck of the Enterprise vibrated with a low, constant hum, part engine, part tension. Everyone could feel it in their boots. The kamikazes had paused, but no one believed for a second that the lull would last. Every man on that carrier knew the clock was ticking. A fresh squadron of Hellcats taxied into position, wings spread wide, gleaming with fresh paint and soot streaks. One by one, they were launched into the sky, their tails lifting just as their wheels kissed the edge of the deck. Each of those aircraft had ridden the deck edge elevator at least once that morning. From a cramped control room just under the island superstructure, boatswain's mate Fulton leaned over a worn metal console, watching pressure gauges twitch as the next lift cycled. "Come on, baby. Just one more clean lift." The platform groaned. It rose, slow but steady, carrying another Avenger into the sunlight. A cheer rippled through the hangar crew below. That was the 12th successful lift since 600. And every single one had fed directly into the fight above. The Enterprise was now serving as more than a weapons platform. She had become a conveyor belt of defiance. Her flight deck never stayed empty for long, and her deck-edge elevator, built years before during peacetime planning and wartime guesswork, had proven itself more than worthy. Elsewhere in the fleet, not every ship was so lucky. Over the TBS radio, word came through that USS Sangamon, a converted escort carrier, had taken a bomb hit that shattered her centerline elevator. Her launch cycle ground to a halt. Planes backed up. Crews scrambled to clear space. But without redundancy, she was a sitting duck. On Enterprise, that kind of stall didn't exist. While one launch cycle completed, another plane was already rising from the side. It wasn't just efficient. It was battlefield evolution in motion. Tex Brannan's second sortie of the morning swept in low over southern Kyushu. Smoke curled from burning train cars near a rail yard outside Miyazaki. AA fire punched the sky, but the enemy guns were slower now, fewer. Every minute that passed, more of Japan's war machine crumbled. Tex's Avenger peeled away from the formation and dropped low, releasing its ordnance in a perfect arc. Explosions rippled across the tracks. Fires spread fast. From that altitude, it was impossible not to think about the men below. Faceless, uniformed, caught in a war most of them hadn't chosen. But war didn't pause for reflection. Back in the formation, his wingman's voice came through the headset. "Tex, we're clear. Let's bring these girls home." He turned his nose toward the sea, toward the black smudge of the fleet on the horizon. As he approached, he saw it again. The deck-edge elevator, still moving, still rising. From the air, the whole deck looked like an orchestrated machine. One Avenger landing, a Dauntless climbing, another Hellcat lining up to go. Sailors waving signals, guns still manned. And that square platform on the edge, the silent hinge between survival and chaos, it never stopped. Tex lined up his approach. The call came through his headset. Banshee 3 cleared for recovery. Watch for crosswind. LSO standing by. He banked, throttled back, and dropped toward the pitching deck. Touchdown. Arresting cable caught. His plane jolted to a halt in under 3 seconds. As the prop slowed, Tex looked left, just in time to see the elevator rising once again, this time carrying a dented Wildcat with Japanese kill markings stenciled faintly under the cockpit. It was scratched, weathered, ready. Like the Enterprise herself. On the bridge, Admiral Mitcher exhaled slowly and looked across the sea. Another wave handled. Another hour survived. Another enemy beaten back not with luck or brute force, but with planning, persistence, and steel that did its job. That elevator hadn't been built for glory. It had been built to move planes. But today, it had carried the burden of a fleet. And it had not failed. May 14th, 1945, 10:55 hours. The Pacific was quieter now. The kamikazes had stopped coming. For the first time in nearly 5 hours, the men of Enterprise allowed themselves to breathe, but not to rest. Above the flight deck, fuel hoses hissed. Ordnance carts rumbled. The catapults retracted and reset with metallic groans. The elevator, battered, blackened, scarred by heat and flying debris, still rose without protest. Each shudder of its frame was met with a steel resolve, like a boxer shrugging off another round. Chief Harmon, hands on his hips, watched the final aircraft of the morning cycle roll onto the lift. It was a Hellcat with half its paint scorched off, a canopy fogged by heat, yet it taxied like a beast unbothered. "One more for the sky," he said under his breath. The elevator did its job. The Hellcat cleared the rails, pointed toward the bow, and thundered forward. By 1100, the ship's air group was airborne again. Not all of them new planes, not all of them flawless, but each one made ready by the hands of men who had endured more than steel ever could. Down in the hangar bay, Boatswain Fulton knelt beside the elevator machinery. One of the hydraulic pistons was starting to weep oil. Not much, a thin trail on the bulkhead, barely noticeable. But to Fulton, it was like blood. He grabbed a wrench and nodded to the nearby mechanic. "After this next lift, we shut her down for 15. She's earned it." Even machines need to breathe, but only after they've carried their load. Captain Groves walked the length of the deck, clipboard in hand. Debris had been cleared. Crews had already painted over the worst of the blast damage. It wasn't cosmetic, it was symbolic. You patched a ship not just to protect it, but to prove it was still fighting. When he reached the edge of the deck, he paused beside the elevator shaft. The platform was rising again, this time carrying supplies, spare tires, 20mm belts, and sealed cans of aviation fuel. There were no cheers, no fanfare, just quiet nods. Respect. That elevator had brought more planes into the air than most airfields on land. And every time it rose, it had done so under fire, under pressure, under the weight of an entire nation's hope to end a war that had taken so much. Tex Brannan stood at the base of the island tower, helmet in hand, staring out across the ship. He'd flown 3 times that morning. He'd seen enemy planes torn from the sky, friends land in flames, and watched men sprint into fire to clear wreckage before the next bird could take off. And through it all, through every single launch, that deck-edge elevator had moved like a heartbeat beneath them. Tex whispered, mostly to himself, "Not bad for a box of bolts." But he knew better. That lift wasn't just steel and hydraulics. It was time. It was tempo. It was trust. After the war, future carriers would carry bigger elevators, newer systems. Automation would replace manpower. Jets would replace prop-driven planes. But the spirit of the deck-edge elevator, what it meant in those final brutal months of the Pacific, would never fade. It wasn't flashy. It didn't make headlines. But it turned the tide in the smallest, most essential ways. It let the Enterprise, and ships like her, stay in the fight. It gave wounded decks the ability to launch one more wave. It gave burned planes another shot at the sky. It gave men the belief that even under attack, they still had teeth. And so, on a warm May morning, soaked in diesel smoke and grit, with gunpowder still hanging in the air, the Enterprise steamed eastward, her decks patched, her crews exhausted, and her deck-edge elevator still rising, still lifting, still fighting, still winning.